Hey guys, I'm Ted, your host, and I'm here to give you another lecture. And for today's lecture topic, we're going to discuss the complete breakdown, the complete disunion of the United States. Really, we're going to just discuss the spread of the rebellion, as it was phrased, in the United States. But before we do that, I just like to do our customary recap and touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we discussed how the different regions in the United States, the different powers and so forth, reacted to Lincoln's election. It was acclaimed and it was hailed in the free states, and it was greeted as the end of everything they held dear in the slave states, and it spurred these slave states to succeed. A number of slave states, beginning with South Carolina and culminating in Texas, a number of them called for secession conventions, passed secession ordinances, and left the Union, left the United States. They met at Montgomery, Alabama, and held a convention known as the Montgomery Convention, where they united, formed a new republic, a new slaveholding republic that they named the Confederate States of America, and set about devising new instruments of government for their new republic. They simply walked out. And it is from there that we'll pick things up. Now, there were those who had advocated for immediate succession. That is, letting each slave state decide and letting the chips fall where they may. Breckinridge's followers, John C. Breckinridge, one of the Democratic nominees in the 1860 election, his followers were typically supporters of this outlook. They called for states to sorry about that. They call for states to simply decide for themselves and to simply leave or stay in the Union depending on their own viewpoints, on their own positions. Now, cooperationists were another group in these slave states. Now these guys, this group, they wanted to wait until all of these slave states could act in unison and bring all of their force to bear on the Republic, on the United States. Upland counties, Bell and Douglas supporters, they supported this ideology. And by upland counties, I'm talking about the mountainous regions of Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, and so forth, Alabama, those regions, typically Appalachian counties, and also the central upland regions of Alabama. These regions, and also the hill country in Texas. These guys favored that. They favored a more controlled group approach to this subject, and not a willy-nilly free-for-all. Had the Breckinridge supporters supported. Now there were unionists. There were unionists in the southern states, and these were people who opposed secession unconditionally. They wanted the states to stay in the United States. Now this view was strongest in the upper and border slave states. Virginia was with a very strong, had very strong unionist sentiment. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and so forth. Delaware were perhaps the strongest of the slave states that have unionist sentiment. That is pro-United States and anti-secession sentiment. Now, though there were a number in the deep slave states, the unionists in the deep slave states were not really able to override the fire eaters and their supporters. Now, outside of South Carolina, cooperationists actually made up about half of the slave states' population. Many in the United States confused cooperationists with unionists, and Lincoln was one of them. Now, to reiterate once again, Unionists opposed secession at all costs. They were unconditional in their support of the United States. Cooperationists supported secession. They simply wanted all of the slave states to come together and to act in unison. They did not want South Carolina going off half-cocked doing what they wanted to do, and Delaware firmly standing in the camp of the United States. They wanted all the slave states to come together and to decide for themselves. They really would have favored a convention, a pan-slave state convention, to decide what to do. Now, the cooperationists, they would have been willing to stay in the United States, but they wanted demands from the Republic in order to do so. One, and chief, was they wanted guarantees, and mainly guarantees regarding the expansion of slavery into the territories, and protections to slave owners taking their properties into slave states. They wanted protections of those rights, and those were things that the free states were just not willing to give them. It was clear that the Republican leadership of the free states were unwilling, the Republican leadership in the United States, sorry about that, was unwilling to give concession to the slavocrats in the Confederate states, or in the states, the slave states in the United States that were edging closer and closer towards the Confederate states. Cooperationists eventually ended up joining the secessionist movement and created a very strong majority in the Confederate states. Now, the secession movement was initially referred to as the Revolution of 1860, and it was hailed as the revolution had the release from the constant wrangling that the nation has seen over the past 10 years in regards to slavery and slavery's expansion. Most people had hoped, and then this was a long shot, but most people had hoped that there would simply be a peaceful separation between the Confederate States and the United States. At the time, secession was only a political separation. There was no violence associated with it yet. Now, that being said, the secessionists did begin to prepare for war. The United States installations and forts across the Confederate States were seized. Militias were increased, and provisional governments authorized. The provisional Confederate government authorized a standing army of 100,000 men. Now, to simply make a comparison between that, at this point, the United States Army had a complete regular army muster roll of 16,000. The secessionists later came to the view that they had not participated in a revolution. This is something that I touched on in our previous lecture. But they later came to the idea that they had not participated in a revolution, but they were rather simply fulfilling the true intentions of the founding fathers of the United States. They proclaimed, they proclaimed that the founding fathers had established a slave-holding republic, and that they had done the exact same thing. That the founding fathers had established a compact between sovereign states who came together to act uniformly, and when they acted uniformly, they were the federal government, and they used that federal government as their agent, has their foreign agent. They contended that they had not given up their sovereignty, and that they were simply reasserting said sovereignty by making secession a legal exercise and not a revolutionary exercise. They hoped to give their nation equal footing with other nations, namely the European states. They used the United States Declaration of Independence to justify their actions, to justify secession. They cited the dissolving old governments portion of that document, which led their opponents, mainly the Republicans and abolitionists in the United States, to point out that they left out the all men being created equal portion of that document. Now, some secessionists even argued that Lincoln and the Republican Party were the revolutionaries, that they were trying to conduct a radical departure from the original plan of the founders. And this brings us up to what is considered the final crisis of 1861, and that would be Fort Sumter, the attack on Fort Sumter. Now, Fort Sumter was a military outpost located in the middle of Charleston Harbor. Fort Sumter was a part of the recovery plan launched in the aftermath of the War of 1812. It was a part of Madison's recovery plan. It was a military installation in the middle of the harbor to protect Charleston Harbor. When Lincoln took office, 7 states had succeeded. Opinion in the United States was moving towards coercing the succeeding states back into the Republic, but many capitalists in the United States, many of the big industrialists, were beginning to worry that if a permanent that if succession was allowed to be carried out, that they would suffer from a permanent loss of business in terms of raw goods, in terms of receiving raw goods, a steady stream of raw goods for their factories and mills, and then also a permanent loss of business for quick available markets for their finished goods in the Confederate States, if those states had were just allowed to leave. They also really began to worry about the disruption of the availability of cash crops for the mercantile elites, for those who held ships that carried the slave states' cash crops across to European markets. They also worried about the permanent loss of that business. So there was a lot of pressure amping up to resolve this issue very quickly, and a lot of that pressure was being put squarely on the shoulders of Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln came onto the scene in March of 1861. March 4th was the original inauguration day for presidents. Lincoln came onto the scene, and he, in his first inaugural address, he stressed that he was going to leave slavery alone where it existed. Okay, he said that he would support an amendment permanently protecting slavery where it already existed. Lincoln again said that he did not support slavery in the territories. That was the only issue regarding slavery that Lincoln would not buckle under. But he again said that he supported slavery where it already existed, and he went so far as to say that he would support an amendment protecting slavery where it already existed. But that was too little too late. To many, Lincoln and the Republican Party were simply radicals. They did not trust, they did not believe that Lincoln really meant what he was saying. They thought that this was simply a very unclever ruse being perpetrated by Lincoln and the Republican Party. So no one jumped at Lincoln's bait. No one jumped at it. Now, lastly, in his address, Lincoln sort of threw down the gauntlet and drew a line in the sand, stating that he would hold, occupy, maintain, and possess all United States property. Now, Lincoln never went into detail as to exactly what he meant, and he was he intentionally left things very vague. Lincoln wanted his statement to be vague and provocative. He wanted to provoke the seceding states, and his statements and the fact that Fort Sumter sat in Charleston Harbor really got the fire stoking in South Carolina. Lincoln did not want to be the aggressor. He wanted the seceding states to take the offensive. He wanted his opponents to be seen as unruly radical aggressors. Now, Jefferson Davis, for his part, did not want to be seen as the aggressor either. And Fort Sumter, as I noted earlier, sitting there in Charleston Harbor, became a key focus point. Charleston was the scene of the first Democratic party nomination for the 1860 election. It was a city that was just rife with emotions, rife with emotions regarding slavery, rife with emotions regarding secession, and rife with emotions regarding the continued presence of a United States garrison in the middle of their city. It did not take long for the South Carolinians to ring Fort Sumter with cannons. There was literally just a ring of cannon surrounding Fort Sumter very early on. The situation was really exacerbated by the fact that Fort Sumter was critically low on vital supplies. Buchanan had sent supplies back in February of 1861, but that relief ship was fired upon and simply returned back to their destination. They were fired upon as they were approaching Charleston. Lincoln decided to resupply the fort after consulting with his cabinet. He made it known. And he told everyone to proceed in as least of a confrontational manner as possible. He informed the sitting governor of South Carolina, of the ship's manifest and its intention. Jefferson Davis also spoke with his cabinet, and they were enraged by Lincoln's move. This was seen as an act of aggression. They leapt on this as the act of aggression. They leapt on this to point Lincoln and the United States as the aggressors. And with this at their viewpoint, that the United States is holding Confederate territory, Confederate States property, and that they are attempting to maintain a presence, an illegal presence in their territory by sending supplies to a garrison that they have in their territory. They left on this has their rationale, has their motivation for. They left on this as their rationale, their motivation for attacking Fort Sumter. And so it was. With political pressure mounting on both sides, Jefferson Davis sent word to demand the capitulation of Fort Sumter. And on April 12th, 1861, the cannons in Charleston Harbor opened fire on Fort Sumter. The garrison was commanded by Major Robert Anderson, a Southerner. He was from a slave state. He was from Kentucky, and he surrendered. He surrendered after a day of heavy bombardment to the Confederate States. No one was killed during the bombardment of Fort Sumter. However, one United States soldier was killed during the salute to the lowering of the United States flag. Now, the reaction to the attack on Fort Sumter brought out the passions in the succeeding states and also in the United States. Those in the United States who had been reluctant to use force against the succeeding states now rallied to the Republic. The Confederate States now seemed to be the aggressors in the eyes of many in the United States. On April 15th, 3 days after the opening of fires and 2 days after the surrender of Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for 75 volunteers to put down the rebellion. Now, in response to this call, 4 of the remaining 8 slave states in the United States decided to secede from the United States. They were Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, and all had been waiting to see how events would unfold. They were willing to stay in the United States, but they were unwilling to use force to compel the succeeding states to return to the United States, and they were unwilling to just sit idly as the United States used force to compel the succeeding states to return to the United States. Now, the departure of Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee was extremely important for the course of the war. Virginia and North Carolina, and in addition to Tennessee, were very popular states. They provided the bulk of the Confederate States manpower. Most of the soldiers came from the Confederate States, from those 3 states. the industrial products used by the Confederate States were all produced in Richmond. Richmond was, as it is then, a major industrial hub of the Confederate of the United States, of the lower southern United States, of the southeast United States. Richmond is a major; it remains a major industrial hub. To go on, the logistical necessities and leadership, an overwhelming majority of those things came from those three states. In terms of horses, mules, and so forth, and for 19th century warfare, you were using horses and mules to pull wagons, to pull cannons, to move cavalry, to move troops. You're using these things. And Virginia and North Carolina, Tennessee, they provide the bulk of these necessities. Also, food. They also provide the bulk of the food that is produced in the Confederacy. Tennessee would be knocked out the war fairly quickly, so it would really fall on Virginia and North Carolina, but they do, and the other slave states too. The problem with the food and these industrial supplies and so forth is that the roads, the infrastructure was so bad in the Confederate States for decades really. They had not kept pace with internal improvements. So that means they were at a significant disadvantage in terms of roads, canals, rail lines, all the things that were necessary for moving goods from one place, for moving peoples and goods from one place to the other. They lacked. And of course, they did this. They kept internal improvements behind deliberately and chose to use river travel as the preferred way of movement, because if you had good roads, multiple good roads, multiple canals, multiple avenues of travel, it simply made that slaves would be able to escape from the deep south and make it to the border states, the lower tier of northern states, of free states. It would simply make the flight of slaves too easy. So that was one reason why they kept internal improvements to a minimum, and why they opposed internal improvements. Because if a slave managed to make it to one of the free states, the network of internal improvements in that slave state would allow the slave to simply be in Philadelphia one day and Chicago the other, or be in Philadelphia and move on to Mass Boston or something. It would or any other destination, I should say, rather than simply have to slug through muddy roads and thick tangles of forest and just really unnavigatable waterways, or difficult to navigate waterways. Now, in deference to Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy was moved to Virginia's capital of Richmond from the old capital of Montgomery in Alabama. Now, as it stood, 11 states had seceded from the Republic. There are 4 slave states remaining in the Republic. The United States and the Confederate States both thought this war will be brief. Let me just caption with that. Both the United States and the Confederate States thought that this war would be brief. They figured that 1 or 2 battles would decide the entire outcome. Now to sort of caption, to sort of end our lecture today, the succession crisis was a very conscious attempt to protect slavery, which was inextricably tied up with the slave states' social and economic order. There could be no threat to the practice of holding slaves. That could not be tolerated. It became very clear early on in 1860, in late 1860 and early 1861, that this is what they were going to be fighting for. That this was the crux of the issue. They saw a very dim future for themselves in the United States, with a national party in control of the government that had abolitionist members and those who had sympathized with the plight of slaves. After their defeat, many former Confederates began to argue that slavery had not been a very prominent issue. This is where the myth of the lost cause comes into play. Former Confederates argued that they had not succeeded over slavery, but over constitutional rights. The state sovereignty is often cited. Now, Jefferson Davis and Alexander Hamilton Stevens were prominent amongst the proponents of the myth of the lost cause. Stevens wrote a tome, really a compendium on the war and succession, and he argued for a very strict constitutional point of view. Has the reason for the outbreak of war, and this is because after the war it became very important for the ex-Confederates to distance themselves from the practice of holding slaves. They knew that it would portray them negatively if they were linked to slavery overtly. Now, that line of thinking was not the case in 1861, as we have seen. When the states were succeeding and establishing this new government, this new nation, the Confederate States, no one was thinking about constitutional rights. They were all arguing for slavery, for the right to expand slavery, for the right to keep slaves. Nobody was concerned about these matters. They were all concerned about slavery. No one was concerned about constitutional matters or state sovereignty. They were all concerned with slavery and slavery's future. To use Stevens and Douglas, two prominent law cause authors, Davis told the Confederate Congress in 1861 that the labor of African slaves was and is indispensable to the South's economic development, with interests of such overwhelming magnitude imperiled. The people of the Southern states were driven by the conduct of the Northern states to adopt some kind of action to avert the danger with which they were menaced. And to follow this up, the Mississippi Secessionist Convention put it plainly: a blow at slavery is a blow at civilization. We have no choice, but we have but two choices: submission to the mandates of abolitionists or dissolution of the Union. And we'll end there, and we'll come back to pick up the unfolding saga of 1861. And as always, I am Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. And as I stated at the end of our previous lecture, it's an ongoing topic of debate. It's a topic that garners a lot of heated exchanges between proponents of the Confederate States and those who oppose the Confederate States, the people who still regard the Confederate States as either illegal or immoral. Illegal in terms of those states did not have the right to form a new government, and immoral because those states formed a government that was that rested on slavery. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture.